Chapter 1. Rohan pulled his pyjama top over his head and looked down, studying his bare torso. He puffed out his chest and prodded a finger here and there. All puberty had done for him in the past 2 years was stretch him out like a beanstalk. The taller he had grown, the skinnier he had become. But recently, he thought his muscles seemed larger. They had to be, because he didn't know how much longer he could take being beaten up by Titus. Titus Blackwell was a hulk of a boy who had gotten more than his fair share of puberty hormones. At just 16, he already stood at 6'4" and was packed with muscle beyond his years. Rohan could attest to that, because for the last few months, Titus had been using his prodigious strength to throw him and his bike around on a regular basis. He had battered Rohan's last bike beyond repair, and since having received a new one for his birthday a month ago, he hadn't wanted to risk bringing it to school. Rohan curled up an arm and flexed it, then squeezed at his bicep, and did the same thing on the other side. Slipping a shirt off a hanger, he put it on and moved around in it a little while he did up the buttons. It felt tight. He was convinced of it now. Although Rohan was still nowhere near as big or as bulky as Titus, his muscles were finally catching up to the rest of him, and he thought now he could at least do something to defend himself. Rohan wheeled his bike out of the garage a short time later, and with his bag on his back, he rode along the streets leading to the school. He slowed when he neared the side gate and scanned ahead to see if Titus was around. The area was deserted. Beginning to relax slightly, he cautiously made his way into the bike shelter. He bent to see the numbers on the chain and turned them to unlock it from below the seat. The sound of cracking gravel came from close by, and Rohan jumped. He spun around with a start. He knew who it would be even before he saw him. With a smirk on his face, Titus stood there, arms folded across his chest, leaning his shoulder casually on one of the poles holding up the shelter. "You're early, Fraser," the giant said, watching Rohan begin to fidget nervously. "You weren't trying to avoid me, were you?" He stood up tall and started to walk slowly towards him. "Go away, Titus, it's new," said Rohan. He felt his stomach clench tight, and keeping a hand protectively on the bike, he moved his body across to stand in front of it. "Yeah, I noticed," Titus said, sounding upbeat. "Nice." "Why don't you find something else to do, rather than pushing people around all the time?" Rohan's voice was raised, having mustered as much bravery as he could. He was sick of this. It had to stop. Titus strolled closer, the smile still on his face. "What, you mean like this?" He gave Rohan a sharp shove in the shoulder, sending him stumbling sideways a few paces. Then quickly, the large boy grabbed for the bike, yanking it out of his reach. "Leave it alone!" Rohan shrieked in alarm. Lately, in compulsory sport at school, which was the only form of sport Rohan Fraser did, he had been running faster and kicking further. He felt strong, and with a burst of confidence, he ran forwards. He launched himself into Titus, shoulder first, trying to throw him off balance. Titus looked surprised and stumbled, but only a bit. Then with one arm, he roughly swatted Rohan away. His face darkened. It was rare for Rohan, or any of the kids at school for that matter, to fight back. He let the bike drop to the ground. Feeling his own anger flare up, Rohan gritted his teeth and ran at the bully a second time, but the other boy was ready. Titus lunged to meet him, and in a matter of seconds had expertly pulled him into a headlock. Rohan struggled and growled, his face turning red, but in that position there wasn't much he could do, and when he realized just how firm Titus's iron grip was, he began throwing punches at any part of the giant's body he could make contact with. Rohan figured he might as well cause as much damage as he could, because with no way to escape, he knew that soon the damage would be inflicted upon himself. "Ugh!" he groaned when Titus's fist finally found his side, followed by a hard blow to his stomach, and then another and another. When the muscled arm finally let go of his neck, Rohan dropped to his knees and pulled his arms into his belly, feeling as if he were about to vomit. He remained there doubled over, staring down at the dirt, gasping in some shallow breaths. The sound of his bike being wheeled away made Rohan want to cry. He felt gutless just sitting there, but he was in too much pain to do anything about it. Forcing his head up, he was just in time to see Titus fling his possession onto the adjacent oval, where it bounced and twisted a few times before coming to a halt. The bully seemed satisfied after that, because he proceeded to stroll calmly away, laughing, not even bothering to look back. Rohan was fuming. He hated being made to feel small, and Titus made him feel that on a regular basis. Once he was left alone, Rohan staggered to his feet. He groaned and clutched at his stomach while he shuffled out across the grass to retrieve his bike. He wheeled it slowly back towards the shelter and locked it up at the back, deciding then and there he would not bring the thing to school again, at least not until he could figure out some way to prevent Titus destroying it. With his arms held across his front, body bent slightly forward, Rohan made his way gingerly towards the school buildings. It still made him feel sick to stand up straight, but he couldn't bring himself to sit cowering somewhere until the nausea passed. He had almost made it to the restrooms before Eve spotted him. He had hoped to avoid her for a bit longer, not wanting her to see him like this. She ran across to him and threw an arm around his back, looking worried. Eve Lawson was a plain-looking girl with straight white hair which hung past her shoulders. She was pale and petite, but she made up for her size with her mouth and the opinions which came out of it in an inexhaustible stream. Rohan and Eve had been friends since first grade. He had been a small timid boy who she had befriended on their first day, and Eve hadn't left his side since. Rohan had never gotten on with the other boys because he wasn't into sport, which seemed to be mandatory to fit into his gender group, and Eve had never been girly, excluding her from fitting in with the other girls, so it had suited the both of them to remain together. "What happened? Was it Titus again?" Eve asked, tipping her head on the side to see his face as she walked beside him. "No," Rohan lied, avoiding looking at her. It was humiliating. "You have to tell someone about this. It's getting ridiculous. You can't—" "No!" he snapped, cutting her off. Rohan turned to head into the boys' bathrooms, and Eve followed. "Rohan, beating your bike up is one thing, but beating you up? Well, that's entirely another," she said. 6 months before, Titus had begun his bullying of Rohan with verbal abuse, but when that had stopped eliciting a reaction, he began to target his bike, and now he had no qualms about beating Rohan up directly. As the pair entered the building, a younger boy using the urinal raised his head in surprise, then quickly angled himself away. "You're in the boys' bathroom, Eve," Rohan said flatly. Ignoring him, Eve came around to stand in front of Rohan, preventing him from walking any further. "Where did he punch you?" she asked, looking down at his belly where he'd been holding his arms. Rohan gave a huff. He hesitated, then slowly edged up the hem of his shirt, but Eve took hold of it and pulled it all the way up before he could stop her. There was nothing really to see other than some red blotches. All the damage seemed to be on the inside, and it felt like it too. "God, have you been doing sit-ups, Rohan?" Eve exclaimed, gazing at his abdomen. She reached out a finger and ran it over his recently acquired contours. Rohan wrenched down his shirt, frowning, then turned and went across to the basins. "There'll probably be a bruise there tomorrow, like all the other times. How long are you planning on letting this go on?" He was embarrassed that Eve was a regular witness to his being made a victim. Standing behind him, she stared at his reflection in the mirror. That certain look on her face. He knew what she was thinking. No, I'm not telling anyone, Rohan said, reaching to turn on the water. I'm going to get him, Eve, myself. He stuck a hand under the stream and, leaning down, began to drink from it. Yeah, right, she scoffed as she watched him. Have you seen the size of Titus lately? He's as big as a house, in case you've forgotten. Rohan turned off the faucet. He straightened up and turned to face her, wiping his dripping chin with the back of his hand. Rohan himself wasn't small. He was only 2 inches or so off Titus's height, but he was still weedy, and now Rohan thought about it, the perfect target for a bully. Picking on a small kid would only make Titus look pathetic, but picking on a big kid, or a tall one at least, well, that would make him seem a little tougher. I don't care, I'm going to get him, declared Rohan with some of the anger in his voice that he had felt earlier in the bike shelter. He knew there was no point talking with her about it. She was a girl, she didn't understand. Rohan went around Eve and led the way out of the restrooms. When they walked into their homeroom, the teacher wasn't yet there, as usual. But Titus was, up the back, surrounded by his dim-looking group of supporters. They sat with their feet on desks, laughing and poking fun at each other and the kids around them. Rohan turned his eyes away as he edged into the front row and took a seat, dropping his bag on the floor. Sissy boy, hissed Titus's voice from up the back, having let barely a minute go by. Rowan's body stiffened. He remained looking straight ahead, wishing that Titus would just disappear. Eve moved in beside Rohan and sat down. Ignore him, she said in a low voice. But the boy was determined. He repeated his taunt several more times, using different emphases and tones. He went on and on and on until Rohan could feel his face turning red, the tension building up inside him. But after a few more minutes of this, it was Eve who finally cracked first. She spun around in her chair to face the back of the room, glaring at Titus. Rowan's stomach clenched tight. He reluctantly turned too, and saw the large boy smirk at having at least provoked one of them. Titus puckered his lips then and made a loud kissing noise in Eve's direction. Her mouth dropped open with indignation, and the crowd of boys around him broke into fits of laughter. Titus bathed in his success, a wide grin spreading across his face. Rohan could see that Eve was livid. The big oaf's eyes remained on her as he uncrossed his ankles on the table. He pushed a foot on the edge of it to tilt his chair, and then began rocking backwards and forwards like he owned the place. Rohan hated him. He couldn't stand the sight of him. Eve frowned and narrowed her eyes further, but this only made Titus and his cronies laugh even harder. Then all at once she stood up. Her chair hit the table behind it, loudly, and without hesitation, she marched out of the row towards the back of the room. Eve, no! Rohan hissed after her, but it had no effect. She continued past the rows of tables until she came to the last one, containing the boys. Come for a kiss, Lawson? Said Titus, grinning like a fool. Rohan watched on helplessly as Eve strode up to the large teenager sprawled over the teetering chair. All eyes were on her, and a hush fell across the room. Rohan prayed that she wouldn't say anything to provoke the big bully even further, because he dreaded the thought of being beaten up in front of the whole class, after he would inevitably go to her aid. Titus blew another kiss at Eve. Then he followed this up by poking out his tongue and waggling it at her. Rohan cringed. Titus Blackwell, said Eve in an even yet determined tone, you are an asshole. And with that, she took one more step, reached out her hand and pushed hard on the back of his chair, sending it and Titus crashing to the ground.